Welcome, and thank you for joining our breakout session on Playing Fair. I'm David. I'm a product manager with Google Play Commerce. I'm responsible for user trust. The last year, John and I have been working together closely with a lot of developers, thinking about how we would create a more fair and balanced platform for your apps and your games.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. My name's John McGuire, and I'm a partner development manager here at Google Play. And David and I are really excited to come talk to you about the ways that we can make developing for Android better. So we titled this talk Playing Fair. And part of this means maintaining a fair in-game economy in your games so you can build sustainable long-term businesses on our platform. So that's the general topic of what we're going to cover today. So now I'll go into the agenda. So briefly, I'm going to talk about what Playing Fair means for Google Play. And then I'm going to hand it over to David, and he's going to talk about a really cool product announcement we have today. But we're actually going to spend most of the time talking with you, the developers. So we have two developers here we're going to invite on stage, and we're going to engage in a fireside chat format with a discussion on what Playing Fair means to them, their principles, their priorities, their challenges. And then if we have some time at the end, we'll save it for you guys to ask us some Q&A, but nothing too hard. So when we started down the path of Playing Fair, we started with two main goals. The first was that we wanted a balanced in-app purchase economy. So if you think about when you have a game and you have a currency in your game, users pay money for that currency. And so you're assigning a monetary value to that currency. And we want you to be able to preserve this, so you control that, and you have the full control over that. So that was the first objective that we have. The second thing is that we want to do the right thing for all users. And this means that for good users, we want to provide a fair and rewarding experience on our platform. But we also, importantly, want to deter the bad users. And so when we combine those two objectives, we hope that we can achieve wins for you, the developers, the users, and us as Google Play. So let me talk about our principles to help us achieve these goals. The first is that we want to do the right thing for all users all the time. And this sounds like a really big, googly, lofty goal, but really it starts with assuming that all users and all developers are inherently good, and we really believe that. And so when they're inherently good, we can provide them access to all of our services, and that's a really important trait to us. But we know from experience, and probably you do too, that not all users are good, and there's a very small minority of them that aren't good. And so we have to evaluate everything on a case-by-case basis or an interaction-by-interaction basis. And sort of to highlight this, let me bring up an example. So who here in the audience has made an in-app purchase before? It's a good showing. I know I have myself. And so let's assume that you give a developer some money, and in turn you get in-game currency. Let's call them coins. Now let's suppose you want a refund for your purchase. Well, in today's in-app purchase world, you get your money back, but you also keep your coins, which is a little bit weird. When you think about that in the physical world, that would be like going to buy a vacuum and wanting to return the vacuum and get a refund, but actually keeping the vacuum. And that's a little bit weird. And so when you think about a good user who wants a refund, they should be willing, we believe, that they should be willing to give up their in-game currency and to get their money back. Now we think about the bad user, and they might not want to give up their currency, but it's still the right thing to do. And so in all cases, both the good user and the bad user, giving up the currency is the right thing to do, and we believe that. So we took these two principles, and we combined them together, and we built an API. And the API will allow you, the developer, to access all of your refunds for your games so that you can take back the currency from the users, whether they're good or they're bad, and make your game more balanced. And that's kind of the big product announcement we have today. So I'm going to hand it over to David for him to talk more about this.
Cool. Thanks, John. So it's 2:30, we're in the basement, and we're going to talk APIs. Cool. Yes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about how generic this API works. Then I'm going to give you some examples. We've been piloted for about 10, 12 months now. And then I'm also going to give you some examples about how some of the developers we worked with have actually implemented this and made huge, huge gains. So I'll do a lot of simplifications. If you have any questions, go find John or me afterwards and talk to us. So the first thing we did is we started looking at all the refunded orders, right? So these are orders that either we gave a refund for or that a bank has given a chargeback on. And we were trying to think about how can we get our developers to know about these orders so you can actually take that physical vacuum cleaner back, right? So what we did is actually, let me just walk you through an example. So what we did is we looked at all the refunded orders. So a user comes into Google Play, maybe made a $10 purchase for 10,000 coins, right? If we approve a refund there, what we do now is we store those orders in a voided order table. So these orders are labeled as in do not deliver or claw back. With the API, what you can do as a developer, you can call this API. It's called the Voided Purchases API. You can receive the data on that order, and you can then claw back the item. So what happens is the user gets their refund approved. They get their $10, right? But once you call that API and you have that order, you can take the 10,000 gems back. So we learned that this works really, really well for refunds. And I have a next slide on impact. So we extended it to other types of orders as well. We looked at cancellations. We looked at banks or issuers giving chargebacks out, and we added those as well. And this works really, really, really well for bad users. It also works well for good users because we believe that as a good user, you're okay getting back your money and willing to give up the coins that you purchased with it. So here's the impact slide. We've been piloting this for about 10 to 12 months with a couple different developers. We've seen really, really big impact everywhere. So on average, we see refunds decrease with more than 60% in about 2 to 3 months' time. Because what happens is it takes time for the community, and especially for abusers, to find out that this abuse factor is gone. So now we get into a little bit more details because, of course, you want to know how can I do this for my game. So this is an early access API. So you have to sign up, and we'll show you a link later on. And we'll also send you the detailed documentation so you don't have to take pictures of this. But broadly, how it works is you give us the start time and the end time of a time period for which you want to have all the voided purchases. You call our API. We give you back a list of orders keyed by purchase token, and then what you can do with that is you can use that to revoke access to those orders. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the 3 different approaches that we've seen developers use our data. I'll go from really, really simple to more complicated. So the simplest way is user purchases something like 10,000 coins for $10, right? We send you the voided order, and what happens is you claw back exactly those 10,000 gems from the user's balance. So the user is now, their current balance minus 10,000. But of course, there's many, many games where you don't only get 10,000 gems, but you get 10,000 gems plus 1 or 2 or maybe 3 special characters. So that's the second case that we've seen, is where developers say, we don't only claw back the 10,000 gems, but also we take anything that we added on to that, some special powers, special characters, and we claw those back as well. The third case that we've seen is, I guess the most complicated case, is where you take snapshots of the user state at the moment of purchase. So say this user bought these 10,000 gems, say 2 weeks ago, and with those 10,000 gems was able to get 2 special characters and go up 3 levels. What we've seen is developers who then, when they get the refunded order, take the user back 2 weeks, right? And then the user is actually back 3 levels, loses their 2 to 3 special characters, and loses the 10,000 gems. So this worked really well in stopping abuse, and we also really believe that this works really, really well for good users. So to gain access, of course, you need to have a developer account registered with Google Play, and you need to have a game that accepts in-app purchases. So if you want to get started, this is the point where I would take a picture because we don't have this, but there's a form that you can fill out, and then we'll whitelist you for early access. So John and I are really, really excited to work with you on this. I think this is just the start for us of getting a more balanced economy where we really try to make the online experience as fair and as balanced as it is offline when you buy your vacuum cleaner. So kind of going back to the goals we had in the beginning, right? We started to create a more balanced in-app purchase economy by allowing you to claw back these items. We're allowing access to all developers. It's early access now, but I'm thinking maybe next quarter we'll open it up for everybody if everything goes well. And this creates wins for all of us. So we really see this as an open discussion between you, us, and our users. So if you have any questions, any suggestions from your communities, feel free to reach out to me, John. Our email addresses will be on the final slide. So with that, I actually would like to invite two developers on stage to share their perspective on fair play, which is going to be really, really exciting. So while we bring up some chairs, I'd like to invite Emily Greer, who's the co-founder and CEO of Kongregate, and Regine Wiener, who's the head of community and player support for Space Ape. And maybe we clap a little bit while they put up the chairs. However way you want to do it. Works for me.
On some musical chairs?
Yeah, we'll do musical chairs. Yeah.
What's the fairest way to do this is the question.
The fairest way to do this is I get all the chairs.
Yeah.
Cool. So maybe, Emily, maybe you can start talking a little bit about your background first, and then Regine, and then we'll dive into some more questions.
So I'm, as I mentioned, the co-founder and CEO of Kongregate. If you're not familiar with Kongregate, we started 10 years ago as a browser game platform, kind of think YouTube for games, maybe not appropriate at a Android event, but an open platform where any developer can upload a browser game. We add a lot of social features and in-app monetization, in which case we were responsible, like Google is now, for the fraud, which on PC can be probably more intense than on mobile. So that's an interesting experience. And then we continue to have that platform, but about 3 years ago, we entered mobile as a mobile publisher and have published more than 25 games, including some of our recent hits include Adventure Capitalist, Animation Throwdown, which is top 50 grossing on Android, and today Peter Molyneux game called The Trail, which is very interesting, that launched today, so you should check it out.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah.
Regine, want to give you a little bit of background?
So, oh wow, that's loud. My background is a little over 15 years in the game industry, starting out at companies like Disney, making a trip through Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network along the way, and finally ending up at Space Ape Games in London a little over 2 years ago. My background is everything from community support to a little bit of development to localization management to project management. So my background's been varied, and it's very much player focused. Our company is founded on those principles, and when you have that, you have to be focused on every aspect of development,
Great.
as well as fair play.
Great. So Regine, let's stay with you. Can you maybe talk a little bit about your philosophy, your company's philosophy around playing fair and level playing fields?
So we are a company full of gamers. We were built on building our own games and making sure that we enjoy them, and then making sure that our players enjoy them. So when something doesn't feel right in the game, it's not going to feel right to your players. And because we as players know that and play it ourselves, we're actually able to balance the economy. We're able to make sure that if there's someone who, as an edge case, is able to exploit the system, we can identify that because we're thinking about doing it ourselves. We always want the advantage, and players always want the advantage. And once you're, so I feel a few giggles in the crowd on that one, but it is one of those things when you're looking at competitive gaming, making sure that you're looking at all the different ways that your game can be played and making sure that you understand how it's going to be played by the different users that you have in your game. We look at it from a level playing field, everyone from our spenders to our non-spenders, because our spenders wouldn't be in the game if our non-spenders weren't there to compete with. Some of our non-spenders are the most creative individuals on the planet who are able to compete against folks who are spending thousands of dollars. And that comes from a very well-balanced game. Given that information, we actually are very cognizant when you have an advantage in the game and you didn't buy it and you didn't earn it. So we have to make sure that when we can claw back those different items as well, and make it a level playing field for both of those audiences.
Which aligns really well with what we just presented, I guess. Emily, what about Congregate? How do you guys look at this?
One of our core strategic principles is building long-term relationships, and that includes developers, players, partners, whoever. And one of the core, core precedents or something core things that you need to have a long-term relationship is you have to have trust and build trust over the long term. And in a game and in almost any situation, it's impossible to build trust if you don't have fairness. There's other elements like transparency and sort of emotional connection, but fairness is like the base of the trust pyramid and has to be, with every decision that you think about, you have to think of fairness, and you have to think of, you have emotional responses to fairness, to what's fair to a particular player, but as important part of community management and player customer service is thinking about what's fair broadly and not just to an individual.
So let me ask you a question about it. So you see fairness as a key part of trust.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that everybody in your company is kind of aligned on what's fair? Because what's fair for me might be not unfair for somebody else who's looking at the same case, right?
Right. A lot of this has been trial and error and mistakes over the years, and interesting because we're a platform. We get to see not only our own mistakes, we get to see the mistakes of developers, and so we get to see a sort of a wide range of behavior. And one of the things coming out of various crises and things that we've come as a core principle is never do anything for someone that you wouldn't do for everybody, or if you would do it for a subset of people that you wouldn't be okay defending publicly on a forum, on a live chat. And that really helps clarify what's fair is, will you say it publicly, will you defend it, will all of us agree on it? And especially in a customer service situation, that's kind of the bedrock is, can everybody stand behind this? And then once you hit that mark, then it's probably fair.
Yeah, I like that, where you're saying the key question for fairness is how I would treat this one individual, is that how I would treat everybody.
Yeah. And how is everybody going to think about that, and how does it all play together? You can't make everybody happy. That's completely impossible.
Yes.
But there's a different level of unhappiness I didn't get what I want, but I see overall that this is fair, versus I got screwed and everybody got screwed.
Thanks for sharing that perspective. So we've announced this API in this basement here today, and it's really exciting. But I wanted to actually address this question to Regine, to talk to you about your experiences integrating the API, because I believe you've had those, and tell us what it's like, and if you think it'll be valuable.
Oh, it's heaven. Okay, so you guys laugh, but player experience starts with being able to provide it to them. If you don't know that this is happening and you don't have a way of dealing with it, it is very difficult to look your players in the face and say, that's not happening in our game. So having access to the API and being able to bring back and claw back the items is very important. The hardest part of integrating this API is not the API. It is deciding the right way to remove the items from your players so that it's fair for everyone. For example, if someone's going to come in, use a gacha, not get what they want, refund immediately, and you're just going to pull those stones or those gacha items away from them, and for example, in our game, it's a duplicate, but duplicates give you resources. So it's valuable to your play style anyway. But if you're going to actually just pull those resources away from them, you're not going to have the same impact. However, if you're going to claw back their last crystal pulls, they can't game the system against you. You just pull the last 10 that they did. Half of the challenge with implementing this is having 3 different games with Samurai Siege, Rival Kingdoms, and Transformers Earth Wars, and deciding how we were going to approach this in each of our games. Because it's not about coins, it's not about gems, it's not about a certain currency, it's about the gacha items and the value of them, and taking that experience. The other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to beat up a good player. Someone came in, they double tapped, they weren't paying attention when they made a purchase. Okay, That happens to somebody. It's going to happen, if that happens twice every 3 months, it's acceptable.
That was never really your money, right? And that's a different thing. Yeah.
It happens, so don't beat your player up for that. However, if someone goes to a restaurant 38 times and they eat their meal 38 times, they leave the restaurant, they call their credit card company, and they get a refund on that meal 38 times, that is criminal. It is not something that you should allow to continue to happen. Beyond that, you have other patrons in that restaurant who are paying for those same meal and are paying for the opportunity to perhaps have that steak that they couldn't have because someone else paid for it, refunded. So you need to make sure that you have a level playing field and that you're providing them with a response that is even and fair for everybody. You refund, it was more than twice, this is how we handle it, guys. I'm sorry that you've done that. We removed the items from you. Yeah. So the hardest part was deciding how you were going to remove it from each game. Yeah. The API itself is something that someone who with base level technology skills can actually do. If your tech team is around and has availability, you can hand it off to them and they'd have it done in an hour. It's a batch process on a nightly basis. And if you hook it into your system, it's great. I would recommend actually running it kind of ad hoc to begin with. And the reason why I say running it ad hoc is you want to be able to make sure that you're removing the right things. You want to make sure there's no double purchases in there. You want to make sure, by the way, the API now checks for that, so it's brilliant. You want to make sure that the players are actually hearing this. The other thing, which is more subtle, is once you start doing this, your familiars, your cheers gang, your MVPs, your VIPs start talking to each other. And it helps keep the honest players honest, and it makes the fraud guys are going to do it forever. But it helps keeps it's the lock on the door.
Yeah, there's a group of players who have so much fun exploiting things that they're always going to exploit.
Yeah.
And then there's people who are so honest they'll always be honest. But the sort of the bell curve are people who will live up or down to their situation. So once fraud gets going in a game, it tends to spiral out of control. But the reverse is possible with cleanup, and we've seen that happen on our platform with different games that started out fine, got into terrible abuse problems, and then with hard work managed to get back to a more even playing field.
We have incredible white hats in our game that when we started bringing all of the kind of fraud back into check and removing items from them, they're writing in going, hey, thank you for doing this. I didn't realize that somebody in my alliance was doing this, and we have zero tolerance for that. And being thanked for that was a very odd experience. It was not the response I was expecting to see. And it's because you're leveling the playing field, and they no longer feel like they're playing against themselves.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the beauty and the simplicity of this API is that you get to take what is a very simple process, which is a refund, and apply it in the right way to your game, because everybody here has a game that's different from each other. And it would be hard to say, apply this one way, this one method to revoking a currency. And so you, I think, have done a really great job of applying this in your game in a way that makes sense for your community. Emily, you're less sort of familiar with the API, I think, and wanted to get your initial feedback.
No, I'm only familiar with our attempts on web to do something similar. But I'm really excited that basically from the moment that we came to mobile, we were looking to figure out if there was a way we could do something like this, and there wasn't. And now I can't tell you how excited I am that it's available.
We're excited for you.
Yeah. I think maybe taking a little bit step back in the conversation, we were talking about good users versus bad users, right? So there's always a small percentage of bad users. They will always keep on trying for different types of motives, right? So how do you deal with those? Do you try to identify them? And then what are the different mechanisms that you use? Emily, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, nothing is ever hack-proof, and so and you could work on it forever. How we organize our time is to think about what's the level of impact of the cheating, and that is going to be very specific game to game. And a lot of it comes down to, are you cheating your own experience, or are you cheating other people's experience? The amount of fraud and cheating that we'll tolerate in a competitive multiplayer game is really, really, really low. But in a game like Adventure Capitalist, if there's a hack where you can, change your phone and move time forward, and there's no leaderboards, and there's no impact to anybody but your own sort of thrill at progress, we'd like to stop that, but we're not going to put as much effort into it. It's not undermining the fun of the game for other people. Yeah. So it's more situational how much effort we'll put into it. And there's situations that are sort of in between, like leaderboards, for example, in a single player game. That is, if you're playing a game and you see nothing but hack scores in a leaderboard, it's not changing most of your feeling, but then it cheapens your accomplishments. So that's a lighter touch than a PvP competitive multiplayer game, but it's still affecting your impact. So then especially on Flash games on the web, you can't stop it, but what we've done is sort of we identify what we think are the cheater scores, and we show cheater leaderboards to cheaters, and we show non-cheater leaderboards to everybody else, and cheaters keep cheating and get their fun out of that, and then people who aren't cheaters get a true experience, and that's how we manage it in that situation. Right. But in other situations, we'll be much more zero tolerance.
So you're telling me that my high score that I see all the time is actually not a real high score, but I fall into the cheater boards?
If you've been cheating, it's never.
Can't comment on that.
You already knew it was fake. It then becomes a competition who's better at cheating.
Yeah,
Just its own competition. It's legitimate at a certain level.
Yeah, but I guess in all seriousness, what you're saying is cheating is bad, but there's various degrees of bad, and when it impacts my good users to a certain extent, when we talk about wars of different clans or groups together, that's when it impacts the bad, where the bad users impact the good users.
And it's is it impacting your sense? Is it impacting somebody else's progress? That's much worse than impacting somebody's sense of achievement. Yeah. And so.
Regine, we were talking about this earlier, and you were telling me about some crafty ways that you guys handled cheaters and some of the ways that you sort of pooled them together. I don't know if you want to share some of your experiences there.
Very similar to what she does. So it's something that apparently we all haven't talked about, but I have a feeling we've been removing cheaters from leaderboards for a very long time, but showing it to them so they continue to think that they're on it and not try and find other ways to exploit issues. But even beyond that, it goes right even down to kids' games, right? You have kids cursing in games, and what you do is you actually show them the curse words to themselves so they get a kick out of it, but you don't show it to the rest of your players because you're impacting the majority of your player base. And the same thing goes with cheating. If someone is actually using scores and are continually running up the leaderboard and they look a little bit out of whack, you move them into a different leaderboard. But that's actually how we engaged with you to begin with. We monitor everything in our economy, and we found somebody who is incredibly out of whack, is the only way to describe it. We look at our numbers every single week, and we know how many gems they have, how many diamonds they have, how many items they have, how many items they should have. And given this, it was leaps and bounds higher than where it should have been. And it was one of those things where 38 times, and it was way more than that, he had gone to the restaurant and was able to redeem the resources. And it was because of the number of times that they have done it and how out of whack the economy was that we were able to actually identify the user.
Do you ever straight out ban users from the game? I mean, the API is about calling back the rewards, but do you do full bans?
There is a finite limit to our generosity. It's one of those things where if you're an honest player and you've done it a few times and we've given you, and by the way, we do in-game warnings, so it's not a surprise to anybody. You got to be fair to them. You've got to send them a message saying, I also give them warning that I'm doing it. So it's not that they've logged into their account and all of a sudden it's gone. It's, this is coming, you've done it. If you do this again, you're not welcome anymore. That kind of behavior has been able to stop the majority of these issues. However, as with any game, we have exploits. And when we detect the exploits because something is out of bounds, even better, we bounce them. So they compete, they do it's one of those things where we impede their progress. They're in there, they're playing their PvP, they defeat the base, we detect the issue, we boot them from the game. They come back, they do it again, they get booted from the game. They don't get their resources, they don't get their gems, they aren't able to gain any advantage of it, they aren't able to continue their progress. And for a while, it'll keep the honest people honest. However, then it basically serves as a honeypot, because then people will start changing the parameters to get just a little bit of an advantage. And those are the people that we look at when we say, okay, this person is not a good person. They are not there to play. They are not there to enjoy it. They're there to exploit the systems and exploit other players, and that's what we ban.
I think that's actually a pretty good segue to the next question, which is, so we're going to launch this API. Everybody here is going to sign up. What would you advise other developers to, like, how should they start thinking about fair play? What is it like the 1, 2, 3 of, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's pretty extreme examples depending on the type of game. Adventure Capitalist is so different from any of the space games. Yeah, an RTS that the level to which you need to do things is very different. I mean, I think the principle of what's the impact to others as in how you deal with it is a good guiding principle, but I don't think I can give you anything more detailed than that, because it really is about your game, and different developers have different tolerances and like ways they want to run their game. Some developers, like it's on principle, are more libertarian, and some are more authoritarian.
Yep.
And you know that's ultimately it's your player's experience, but it's your game, and you can set those ground rules, and they would probably implement the API differently.
Yeah, I think just to give like one tip, what we've typically done in our pilots is 1 to 2 weeks of data analysis. So just looking at histograms of, you know, where are the outliers of people or countries or levels where it really looks like really, really bad.
Yeah.
And then I think the second thing you do is, like, if you see a lot of volume there, how does it impact others? That's that's probably a good way to think about it. And then how would you change your game economy with the new information you have to stop that egregious behavior?
I'd also want to look at why.
Yeah.
For example, if you're running a gacha game and your drop rates are far too low, that it's time to look at your gacha rates. If your gacha rates are far too low and your refunds are far too high, it's time to have a conversation.
And that gets back to actually trust and to fairness. Is if players don't trust you, they're more likely to cheat. They're also more likely to cheat if they don't trust each other. But you are a factor in the equation.
One of the things we've touched on in a few of these conversations has been the role of community and what that means for fair play. And they sort of go hand in hand in some ways, because if you upset your community, people are going to leave and potentially abandon your game. But could you tell me how you think about approaching community and the role that it plays when you consider fair play in your games?
You want to take it first, or?
I mean, I guess, sure. What I would say is our goal is community, and fair play is a means to creating a good community, and that community is sort of is what lifts a game above a pedestrian experience. It makes it, you continue to play a game. I mean, you'll play a game only so long just for it being fun. You'll play a game so much longer if you have friends and if you have an emotional connection to the game. And that's something that you get from community. And so, you know, fairness is a means to that end. And that's how I think about it.
So we love our players. I know you guys all say you love your players. We love our players. They are welcome to come visit. That's how transparent we are. Specifically, the ways we communicate with them are a little bit different than a normal developer. Of course, we put our release and patch notes out. Of course, we put up a wiki. Of course, we put content in news feeds. But beyond that, they have access to us via band chats. They have access to via Twitch. Our developers are sitting in Facebook pages. It's very strange, but it's very manageable. I mean, we have 20 to 30 million downloads. The number keeps growing, obviously. And when you think about it at that scale, you say, how can I attack this? But you start with your influencers and you bring them in and you make sure that they understand and they become your voice. And you create a relationship with them, and then the trust builds. And when trust is there, believe it or not, it's going to affect your bottom line, because they're going to play one game, they're going to move to your next game, they're going to move to your third game, and you start building brand affinity for your company, not just for your games. And they trust you, so when something does go horribly wrong, as we all know as developers they do, hourly, particularly at lunchtime, so I feel for you today. It's going to be a long night. When you launch, having that trust and that affinity and the transparency to be able to say, hey, listen, guys, I acknowledge it, and truth with being very truthful with your players gives them a little more breathing room to say, hey, you know what? You guys messed up. I'm going to let it go. I'm going to give you a buy on this one. But make sure you take care of them. Would you want to have, for example, would you want to have an item taken away from you? Would you want to have one player receiving one bundle and another player receiving a different type of bundle for half the cost? You wouldn't want that. So when those issues pop up, make sure that you treat players fairly, and they'll trust you more, and they'll spend more because they trust you. The other thing I will say is we manage 24/7 support. We do it in 11 different languages. I've got 30 or so folks. We're embedded inside of the game teams. Each game team has a CCS lead. They feed back to the agents. Our agents can talk to our developers at any point. So they don't feel like they're having a conversation with an anonymous developer, and they do see the actions are resulting in, feedback is being taken and implemented.
So Google is a very a data-driven company, or known for being a data-driven company, and one of the things we're always into is measuring. And so do you, in this community and this trust aspect, how do you measure community trust, or do you measure it? Because I'm sure some developers are in the audience thinking like, I could spend an extra effort to go through providing Twitch streams and providing kind of 24/7 support, but how do you measure the community trust or sentiment, if you do?
Player purchases, retention, lifetime value.
And you can draw direct
sentiment.
Correlations too.
Absolutely. If you looked at a lifetime value of a company that doesn't have support versus a company that does have support, you would find it significantly higher. Or community events, live events in-game. It shows that it's active and alive, and they're willing to stay for that. Apologies.
Yeah, I would say it's hard to measure directly. Retention is going to be the best measure by far. Long-term retention, obviously not short-term. And one of the things that we like to look at is momentum and look at not pure retention, but looking at ratios of retention. So how, what's your change from D7 to D30, what's your change from D30 to D90, because different games and different genres are going to have different baselines, but that tells you a lot about that experience. So that's one way of looking at it, but that's still, a lot of that is going to come down to the game. One thing is it when you see it. If you go into a forum, you can tell really quickly what the overall sentiment and in 10 minutes, and now you can't measure that and track it in a really clear way, but we do some tracking. Our community management do weekly summaries and sometimes daily summaries for developers and talk about sentiment, and we track that over time. And then the other thing that we do is just tracking fraud rates on purchases over time, and that, that's not going to tell you strength of community, but it tells you when things are going off the rails, and that you will see that happen pretty quickly, and when you will see it come back down as well. That can be extremely dramatic.
So we do win-back rates because players in the RTS genre will burn out pretty quickly. 9 months in, they'll say, I need a break. Question is, do they come back a month and a half later because they're invested in your community, they're invested in the game, they're invested, they've taken their break? That's a very interesting metric to look at. Do they come back? Do you reconnect with them and say, hey, your account's always going to be here, and we've put some extra goodies in there? Yeah. If they come back, you're doing right. If they don't come back and you have a very high percentage of opens and they just delete it, that also is a very interesting metric, because they saw it, they opened it, they looked at it, and they said, nah.
Yeah, it's similar to long-term retention with them with a break. I was wondering if there's any questions from the audience. We still got some time, so I guess, we can just shout them out or use the microphone, or both.
You ever done any cohort analysis on your high-value consumers who have actually gone through this fraud return system?
Yeah. So here's the great news. There are multiple different ways of implementing this. You can put these people into the negative and make them re-earn back up, and you do see them do that if they're actively engaged. And if you see, for example, your golden cohort just refunds his entire account, that guy's never coming back regardless. And it's really interesting. Do it, because the other thing it does is it increases the trust with the existing players so they don't feel like they're spending into a black hole. Your MVPs are talking to each other every single day, whether they're talking through the systems that you've provided, or they're online, or they're using Band, or they're on Facebook, or they're using any other mechanism, but they are talking to each other. And as soon as one person says, listen, I refunded and this happened to me, it sweeps through your entire community. And you know what? The majority of the people are like, I'm glad they're finally doing that. That was so unfair that this guy had been doing that for 6 months. And they start spending more. It's been a nice bump.
Yeah, and what I would say is if you do something that the player doesn't like but seems fair, they will retain. And we've seen that because we have so many games on our web platform. We've had games, a particular Chinese game that had a very different idea of community management and customer service than our players were expecting, went into a full-blown crisis that resulted in, I think, 70% of players requesting refunds from us in 1 month. And we worked through, I mean, that was trial by fire and a lot of like 10 p.m. Phone calls with translators to try and work through it. And what ended up happening is we managed to save about half of the players to the game, and the rest of the players we managed to save to the platform. And that they still didn't trust the game, but they trusted us in terms of our attitude. And that was 5 years ago, and pretty much every one of the big spenders who we went through that with is still an active spender on the Kongregate platform. So they weren't happy, but they were, and we did claw back a lot of stuff and banned some from the game, but kept them on the platform. Complicated things, but you can keep them, and they're really, really worth keeping. The people who are most upset are the people most worth keeping.
Passion.
Yeah.
I actually have 2 questions, if you guys don't mind. First question is, how transparent are you guys with the community in terms of like when you guys are implementing bans or like showing evidence, or is it just like very like mysterious, like, hey, we've caught these things? Like, how much communication do you have down to the specifics?
If I'm talking to you and it's your account, you know what you've done. You don't know how I know, but you know what you've done. If I am talking to someone who's trying to talk to me about you, my relationship is with you. My relationship is not with your alliance leader. So we do tell them that this is what we're doing. We do tell them that this is how we're handling refunds. It's on our FAQs. It's in the public domain that this is how we handle things and that we do deal with it and address it. However, I will never discuss a player's account with someone that's not the player.
Thank you. And then the second question I have is whether with the clawback API or just clawbacks and bans in general, are there common pitfalls in which you guys have been over-aggressive or things to avoid?
There is. So make sure you're logging everything. I mean, that's the reality of the game. You have to make sure you log it so that you know what you're taking away. The other thing is take a snapshot before you take anything away, just in case you get it wrong. And that if you do get it wrong, mea culpa and give them something a little extra for your error. Don't be shy about it, and don't try and hide it. The other thing I'll tell you is that when you are clawing back something, the player has done something they should not have done. And if they are a good player, they acknowledge it and say, listen, you know what? I got a refund. I'm not entitled to this. If they're a bad player and they're like, but I have spent $4,500 with your company and I only refunded 570 of it. Be like, yeah, that's 570 errors. You don't get to keep it. And I do want to understand why that person does it. So it's helpful and we're able to gather feedback from it. But in the end, you have done something you knew you shouldn't have been doing. You've been caught. Let's deal with it that way.
And maybe to your first question, so in our pilots, we've seen different types of communication. So I've seen one developer who went out, created a website, had the community managers talk to the community, and every time when your refund an order gets clawed back, you actually have an in-game message that's blocking, that's like a pop-up, and it shows up in your inbox as well. We have other developers who do it more in the back end, where they still take the gems away and send you an email. So we kind of seen both. It really depends on how close you are with your community.
Go in game.
And how you want, yeah.
Always do it in game. I can't recommend it enough.
The other thing is, whatever your communication with a player, expect that it will be copy pasted to other players, into forums, etc. So again, like being really, really consistent on your policies, and a lot of time that means like just getting everybody together and like whiteboarding out exactly what you're going to do, arguing it out and getting it straight so that you can have that total consistency. And if it's a major error, especially, if you've made a mistake and you're trying to make it right, you want that totally public and in your face. Something that's more individual, yes, keep it individual, but again, if you would mind having this email in your forums, don't write that email.
It's really interesting. We actually, sorry, are we over time?
You can finish your thought, and then
right.
we're going to finish up.
All right, so as everyone knows, we had an outage or an issue with an attack on the East Coast, and it's right during an event. And when you're doing live events, you are feeling it for the players because they want to get in there and they want to play, and it's a hard alliance event. Well, what do you do for players? Like, listen, I just lost 12 hours of this 36-hour event or this 48-hour event, and it results in refunds. Because they're like, listen, I spent this money, I couldn't use it, I got in sporadically. What you do in that instance is you extend the event if you can do it, but if you can't, you need to level the playing field for everybody who partook in it. And you need to be vocal about it. You can't just say, oh, well, you're lost. That's not the right way to develop a relationship with your audience, your players.
That seems like a really good note to end on. Regine, Emily, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.